Hello, everyone. We're just about at the top of the hour here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome today to our webinar. If we can just advance the slide one. Welcome to today's webinar, Working at the Intersection of Intimate Partner Violence and Mental Health. This is the third, I believe, in a series of webinars, and today's topic is intimate partner violence, suicidality, and disabling psychiatric conditions, the unique risks, needs, and strategies. We're happy to have you with us here today. Our presenters today are Dr. Carol Warshaw and Gabriela Zapata-Alma, who I'll introduce in a minute. My name is Ann Murphy, and I'm the co-director of the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We'll be facilitating today's webinar. I also want to acknowledge some colleagues who are with us today, who you might see in the chat and in the Q&A. Kati Rivera is the project coordinator for the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. And she'll be responding to questions and comments in the chat box. And Tamar Westfall, who's the communications manager with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, who you'll see in both the chat and the Q&A, responding to questions and comments there. And we also have Ricky Canello, who's with our National Network Coordinating Office for the MHTTC, who's helping on the tech end. So thanks to everybody for being with us. Next slide. Just a few housekeeping items. We've made every attempt to make today's webinar presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we'll follow up with you using your registration information. All attendees are muted and cannot share their video, so you don't need to worry about muting yourself. If you have a question for the presenters, we ask you to use the Q&A pod. We'll answer any questions in there that can be answered briefly. Otherwise, we will collect your questions and I will present them to the speakers at the end of the presentation today as time allows. If you have a comment or you want to share a link with all attendees, you can use the chat box for that. I just do want to make sure that you're aware that you can control who can see your comments in the chat box. So if you want everyone to see what you type, you want to make sure to click on the down arrow next to the 2 and change the default. So the default is that only the panelists will see your comment. If you want everyone to see, switch it to all panelists and attendees, and then everyone on the webinar can see what you want to share. The session is being recorded today, and both the recording and the slide deck will be posted on the MHTTC website within a few days. And you'll also receive an email following the presentation on how to access your certificate of attendance. And if you don't already, we encourage you to follow us on social media and stay in touch with us there. Next slide. The MHTTC network, for those of you who might be new, is funded by SAMHSA and accelerates the adoption and implementation of mental health related evidence-based practices across the country. We do that by developing and disseminating resources, providing free local and regional training and technical assistance, and by other activities and products that help to heighten the awareness, knowledge, and skills of the mental health workforce. The MHTTC network is made up of 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Next slide. This is just a map that shows you those, each of the different MHTTC centers and the different 10 federal regions that comprise it. You can go to www.mhttcnetwork.org and click on your MHTTC, and it will help you find your specific regional center. Next slide. This is just, this webinar series is just one example of the trainings that are offered by the MHTTC network. They're all free of cost, and we encourage you to check out the website to see what else is available. Next slide. I'm going to take just a moment, since we're getting the opportunity to facilitate today's webinar, to highlight my center, the Northeast and Caribbean. We cover New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. And this is our contact information if you're within our region and you're interested in being in touch with us. Next slide. And we have an area of focus that looks at evidence-based practices for people living with serious mental illnesses, including supported employment, illness management and recovery, supportive housing and supported education, as well as what we view as foundational skills related to trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, suicide risk assessment and prevention, and a variety of other topics that are important to the mental health workforce. Next slide. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network on under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. Next slide. As part of receiving SAMHSA funding, we are required to submit data related to the quality of this event. So we ask that at the end of today's training that you take just a moment. It really truly only takes 1 to 2 minutes to complete a very brief survey about today's session. Next slide. Okay, and I think I've got all the housekeeping out of the way, so we'll get to it here. I want to take a minute, next slide please, to introduce our presenters. We have Dr. Carol Warshaw, who's the director of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and a faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Illinois. Dr. Warshaw has been at the front of developing collaborative models and building system capacity to address the mental health, substance use, and advocacy concerns of survivors of domestic violence and other trauma, and to create accessible, culturally responsive domestic violence and trauma-informed services and organizations. Along with her is Gabriela Zapata-Alma. She's the Director of Policy and Practice on Domestic Violence and Substance Use at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and is a faculty member at the University of Chicago's School of Social Service Administration. Gabriela brings over 15 years of experience supporting people impacted by violence, mental health conditions, substance use disorders, trauma, housing instability, and HIV and AIDS, and providing counseling, training, advocacy, and policy consultation, as well as leading programs using trauma-informed approaches, motivational interviewing, harm reduction, gender-responsive care, housing first, and third wave behavioral interventions. We're very happy to have both of them with us today, and I will turn it over to Dr. Warshaw to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Anne. So we're delighted to be talking to you today. It's the third of a series of webinars, and today we're going to focus on intimate partner violence, suicidality, and in disabling psychiatric conditions, and the unique risks and needs and strategies that we can employ that to work with people who are experiencing both suicidality and disabling psychiatric conditions. Next slide, please. The National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is also funded by HHS, and a couple layers down, the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, Family Youth and Youth Services Bureau, Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. And we're one of 4 special issue resource centers, and ours is the only center in the country dedicated to addressing the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health together, both for adults, children, and parenting and youth. And we provide, similar to the MHCTC's comprehensive array of training and technical assistance services and lots of resources that we'll share with you. We also do research and evaluation work, policy development and analysis, and try to make, raise public awareness around the issues that are at the intersection that we focus on. Next slide, please. And this is a disclaimer from our funders. Next slide, please. And these are the learning objectives that you signed up for to address the complex and multi-directional relationships between intimate partner violence, suicidality, and disabling psychiatric conditions for survivors of intimate partner violence, to assess the potential role of IPV in precipitating or exacerbating mental health crises, and to actively collaborate with survivors to develop individualized person-centered safety strategies in mental health crisis prevention and recovery planning, including intimate partner violence informed psychiatric advance directives. So we're going to spend the first part just doing an overview of the research with a focus on today's priorities, and then talk about some practical strategies, both for addressing suicidality and for the unique issues that are faced by people who experience disabling psychiatric conditions. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do for the first couple of slides is kind of review the things we talked about in our previous webinars in case you weren't able to participate or haven't had a chance to listen to them yet. So the first thing is our kind of framework that we approach our work with, and a framework for thinking about the intersections of domestic violence, trauma, and mental health. And it's what we call an ACRTI approach, or accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approach. And we developed this in part when we started doing this work actually in the late 90s to bridge the gaps between the domestic violence and mental health fields. So our work is grounded in a kind of domestic violence, sexual violence advocacy approach, which is empowerment-based, survivor-defined, where we really view survivors as the expert on their own experience, and that people always have a choice when they've been experiencing many situations, whether it has to do with a mental health condition or abuse, interpersonal violence, where their choice was taken away. So it's a kind of a approach that involves a radical equality and kind of the antithesis of what the experience of abuse and violence are, and the abuse of power and control. It's also rooted in very much in a human rights and social justice perspective, and highlights the importance of cultural, historical, and community context. Historically, the domestic violence field really didn't address mental health because of how mental health conditions were used against survivors by abusive partners and by many systems that survivors sought help in. And the mental health field often didn't recognize the role that intimate partner violence played in a person's mental health symptoms or presentations. And when we started doing this work in the 90s, trauma theory actually provided the bridge. So creating a kind of trauma social justice DV approach was how we were able to bridge these gaps in philosophy and in approach to practice. We know that interpersonal violence and trauma, including intimate partner violence, is objectifying and dehumanizing. And so that part of our approach is to kind of rehumanize and to think about the implications for the kinds of treatment we provide, whether it's directive and controlling, whether it's pathologizing, or whether it really is survivor-centered and defined. So a couple things that's specific to this, this webinar. I don't know how many, the mental health field has really changed dramatically in the last 20 years. And a trauma-informed approach has been very much adopted throughout the mental health field. But I don't know how many of you are familiar that the whole concept of the trauma-informed approach really was a human rights, grounded in a human rights perspective, and led by survivors of trauma who'd been actually hospitalized in inpatient settings, often by the people who were abusing them, and were re-traumatized and re-victimized in those settings. So that the whole field is really has really evolved from a kind of peer recovery-oriented approach. When we were doing a project in 2007 with an Office on Violence Against Women Disabilities grant, we were working on trauma and intimate partner violence in the lives of people who were living with a psychiatric disability. And we partnered with our state mental health system. We're doing trainings around the state, and we're using state psychiatric hospitals because they around the state to host the trainings. And it turned out the first hospital we were working with was founded by a psychiatrist who had been abusive to his wife and had her hospitalized as a form of abusive power and control. The very first patient I saw in my psychiatry rotation in medical school was someone who was hospitalized because she was being abused. She said, "I'm here because I'm being abused by my partner." So again, this is something we may recognize, we may not. I'll show you some of the data that helps make it really clear how prevalent this is. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is just a summary of the things that we've been talking about for the last 2 webinars. Quick review, we know that being abused by an intimate partner has traumatic health, mental health, and substance use related effects. At the same time, there are high rates of intimate partner violence among people who receive treatment in mental health and behavioral health settings. Additionally, people who perpetrate intimate partner violence deliberately try to use mental health and substance use related issues as a way to undermine and control their partners and to actively keep them from achieving their treatment and recovery goals. These forms of abuse not only undermine the well-being of survivors, but also compromise the effectiveness of mental health and substance use disorder treatment, and making it really critical for all of us to create policies and practices that address intimate partner violence, no matter what settings we're working in. Next slide, please. And this is the last summary slide from the last 2 webinars. This is just a kind of visual representation of thinking about, we're looking at the traumatic effects of abuse, the psychophysiological effects and the effects on multiple domains of people's lives. But in the context of intimate partner violence, we're also looking at ongoing coercive control that's undermining people's sanity and sobriety, controlling their access to treatment and other resources. So it's both the effects and the things that are producing the effects. And again, when we take this out to a broader social context, we think about the traumatic legacies of historical trauma and the many ways that individuals and communities are affected across generations. But we're also thinking about the ongoing structural violence and the policies that perpetuate abuse and violence and trauma and discrimination. So again, it's a much more comprehensive approach. And, as clinicians, we're often focused on healing the traumatic effects of abuse, and advocacy, the DV advocates are often focused on changing the conditions that produce it, and that's part of why it's so critical for us to keep working together. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So, we talked about some of the research in the previous webinars, and I wanted to focus in more specifically on how this impacts people who have disabling psychiatric conditions who are living with them. So when we look at, this was a meta-analysis population, looking at population studies, we can see there are very high rates of past year intimate partner violence, and past year is a proxy for ongoing risk as opposed to lifetime that happened sometime in the past. And you can see very stark differences between women who are living with a disabling psychiatric condition versus not, and same for men. So for women, it's 20% versus 5.3%, and for men, experiences of intimate partner violence for a man who has a disabling psychiatric condition is 6.9% versus 3.1%. And for past year sexual intimate partner violence among women, the relative odds were 30 in 1,000 women versus 4 in 1,000 women. And the last set of data is for people who are living with a disabling psychiatric condition versus people who weren't, or 2 to 5 times more likely to experience one of 3 forms of intimate partner violence, emotional, physical, or sexual, 2 times as likely to experience some type of mental or emotional difficulties, and 5 times more likely to attempt suicide as a result of the intimate partner violence. So again, thinking about the settings that you're working with and who the people are that you're seeing, this is maybe more prevalent than you have realized. They also found some data that people were more likely to disclose to health professionals than to their social networks. So again, you play a critical role in both making it possible for people to feel safe talking to you about any abuse and violence that they're experiencing. Next slide, please. So again, thinking about psychiatric settings, previous day we looked at more at outpatient settings. When we look at inpatient settings, lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence, you can see there's quite a range, 34 to 63% for women and 14 to 48% for men. But again, the studies just vary widely in their definitions and methodology, but it's still very, very high. When we look at previous year intimate partner violence, it's still very high, 22 to 76% for women, 48% for men, and these are on average across studies. In psychiatric emergency rooms, rates are very high, so think about when someone comes into an ER, what kind of crisis they may be coming in with, and who is accompanying them, and is that safe. The fourth piece of data I wanted to share was around, this is a study that was done by Lisa Goodman and Marion Dutton in 1995, looking at women who were episodically homeless, who were in treatment, who had disabling psychiatric conditions. And you can see the lifetime prevalence of physical intimate partner violence was 80% and 40% lifetime sexual intimate partner violence. And in their study, they found that almost it was like 89, 90% of women had experienced some form of abuse and violence trauma in their lives. So again, just thinking about the people that you're seeing in your practices, in your clinics, in your whatever practice setting you're working in. Next slide, please. So we also know that exposure to ongoing abuse can exacerbate symptoms and precipitate mental health crises and make it much more difficult for people to access resources and services. And at the same time, experiencing mental health symptoms increases an abuser's control over their partner's lives. So we know that research has consistently found that exposure to abuse is a significant factor in the development and exacerbation of mental health conditions and influencing the course of recovery. And we know that random population studies and studies conducted in clinical settings indicate that experiencing intimate partner violence places people at significantly higher risk for experiencing depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, chronic pain, insomnia, substance use disorders, suicide attempts, and experiencing greater unmet mental health needs. So again, same thing we've been talking about. It creates symptoms, exacerbates pre-existing conditions, and then impacts people's ability to access services. Next slide, please. So, last time we did talk about depression and PTSD, but we wanted to provide a little more context. So experiencing intimate partner violence dramatically increases the risk for developing major depressive disorder and nearly doubles the risk for postpartum depression. So people don't always think about the role of intimate partner violence in the development of postpartum depression. And risk factors include the recency and severity of intimate partner violence and other trauma, and obviously that experiencing major depression or PPD increases the risk for suicide. Similar with intimate partner violence and PTSD, there are very high rates. Weighted mean prevalence is 61%. And risk factors, again, the cumulative burden of trauma. There are certain types of trauma that increase risk or that have independent risk factors like particularly sexual assault and childhood abuse, childhood sexual abuse. There's also psychological abuse is an independent risk factor for the development of PTSD. We also know that cessation of violence and access to social support actually improves symptoms of depression and PTSD. We also know that with PTSD, there are other contextual factors that are really important to keep in mind. The ongoing danger but risk of coercion and control, but prolonged stress related to custody battles, unsupervised visitation with kids visiting with an abusive partner that puts the survivor at risk, prolonged mediation and divorce hearings, dragging a partner into court over and over again till their funds are depleted. And the other piece that contributes is re-traumatizing experiences. We did focus groups with women in a range of psychiatric settings as part of the projects I talked about earlier, who talked about feeling very unsafe in mixed gender settings and being re-traumatized in those settings. Often there were perpetrators there or even people who were loud and scary to them. So again, thinking about that, and then people being rejected from service settings because they don't meet criteria, because an abusive partner is preventing them from complying with whatever the treatment requirements are. So keeping all of those in mind is really critical. And again, safety, access to resources and social support, and IPV-informed treatment are really critical. Next slide. This slide is on the thinking about suicidality in the context of intimate partner violence. And as we've said previously, that IPV increases the risk for suicide significantly. Recent reviews have noted that rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts are 3 and 4 times higher among women who've experienced intimate partner violence versus women who haven't. In community samples, 23% of women experiencing IPV reported a past suicide attempt versus 3% without a history of intimate partner violence, and over 36% of survivors seriously considered suicide. Likewise, several studies have found that rates of intimate partner violence are higher among women who have suicidal ideation or have attempted suicide. And there was a study by Heru et al. That found that over 90% of women who were hospitalized post-suicide attempt reported current severe intimate partner violence. Similar numbers for men who were hospitalized for suicide attempts in that study. In the last study, this was a study of African American women who were suicidal. They were recruited from healthcare settings, and they had 2.5 higher rates of physical intimate partner violence and 2.8 times higher rates of emotional intimate partner violence. So again, very high rates, and thinking about whether we routinely ask about intimate partner violence in the context of suicidality and suicide attempts. Next slide, please. Again, for a little more context, thinking about what kinds of things contribute to suicidality, again, the types of abuse, the cumulative burden of abuse, sexual violence is psychological abuse are major risk factors. When we think about mental health coercion that we've talked about before, the gaslighting and the undermining of person's sanity contributes. The risk for potentially lethal assault also contributes to risk. Some people talk about this as a resistance. I'm not going to let him kill me, I'm going to kill myself. So thinking about that when you're working with people. Having a chronic or disabling health condition as well may lead people to feel more trapped and helpless. Again, hopelessness, substance use, and psychological distress are risk factors in general, as are PTSD and depression. But the thing I wanted you to really think about is around the fear and entrapment and inability to escape, where suicide feels like the only way to manage. Like people may try to manage symptoms in a variety of ways. They may self-medicate, and then when nothing else is possible, suicide or homicide may feel like the only way out. There was a recent study done by Manjula O'Connor. It was sort of our psychiatrist in Australia, who's our counterpart there in doing this work. And she was talking about recently a study they did with South Asian women in Australia, and that women who were suicidal and depressed, who were able to leave an abusive partner, did significantly better. And for women who remained trapped in those relationships, it was very difficult. The treatment was much harder to provide successful treatment, and that this has all been dramatically amplified by COVID-19 and having to be trapped at home with an abusive partner. Next slide, please. This slide is just a study that we want to highlight around experiences of psychosis in 4 U.S. cities, and that what they found was that people who had experienced at least one form of IPV, and again, physical, psychological, emotional abuse, were much more likely to experience at least one and often multiple types of psychotic experiences, and what they called strange experiences, paranoia, thought insertion, and hallucinations. And this was true for both men and women. The association was stronger for people who were more historically marginalized, for Latinx people who are Latinx or LGBTQ, members of the LGBTQ community. And there were strong associations. The strongest associations were with threats of abuse and violence, sexual, intimate partner violence, and psychotic experiences. So again, we don't often think about those connections. You know, we were trained to think about psychosis as something that's mainly biological or potentially genetic or drug-induced. So just thinking about this context, I know, so again, higher rates. Next slide, please. So again, when we bring back the context of mental health and substance use coercion that we've talked about the last 2 webinars, do we think about psychiatric disability as making someone more vulnerable, or it puts them at increased risk because abusers know that they can get away with it? And part of why they can is because the stigma associated with mental illness that allows people to discredit someone who has any kind of disabling psychiatric conditions or symptoms. So one of the things we know, and this is from more qualitative work that we've done, that abusive partners will induce a psychiatric debilitation by controlling meds, preventing their partners from taking meds, disrupting their routines, coercing them to use, or coercing to use medications that actually induce psychotic symptoms. We've talked before about coercing someone to take an overdose and then trying to have them committed to a psychiatric institution, controlling their treatment, and then saying, oh, I had to restrain her, she was out of control. And we know that choking and strangulation is a potentially lethal form of intimate partner violence. And we know that part of why this works is because often reports of abuse may be attributed to a person's delusions, when we know that experiencing intimate partner violence or other forms of abuse may be the precipitant to a psychiatric crisis. Symptoms of trauma may be misdiagnosed as symptoms of another mental health condition. The assumptions that having a psychiatric disability precludes good parenting, and often people who abuse their partners align with family court judges around this as a way to control their partners. And then the internalized stigma around mental illness or substance use that people take in, so that people don't feel like they have a right to protect themselves. Next slide, please. And then the last slide that I'm going to talk about for now is thinking about the intersection of intimate partner violence and disabling psychiatric conditions and the unique barriers that people face. So we know that people who are living with a disabling psychiatric condition are at higher risk for abuse, which we just talked about, and also for experiencing additional layers of trauma, including from people in their social networks, from within their families, in public spaces, from being in institutional or residential service settings, in addition to intimate partner violence. We also know that people have higher rates of lifetime abuse and PTSD, including in relation to experiences of psychosis, which can also induce PTSD, medication side effects, and the experience of being hospitalized. So there are other layers of experiences that generate trauma. And we also, I just mentioned that responses to previous trauma and internalized stigma may increase risk, or, for someone who maybe dissociates in response to trauma and then is less attuned to cues of danger. There are many different ways that this can play out, but I think, as Maxine Harris has often talked about, that people may not ever have learned that they have a right to protect themselves from harm. We also know that the risk of abuse is exacerbated by experiences of poverty, housing instability, unsafe living conditions, and reliance on caregivers. And we know that intimate partner violence is often a precipitant to homelessness, and it's particularly prevalent among women with psychiatric disabilities who experience a lack of housing. So, thinking about that from both sides of both psychiatric disabilities and intimate partner violence contributing to homelessness, and placing people at greater risk for other kinds of trauma. And again, I mentioned survivors often face a lack of gender-specific treatment, services, and spaces. They also may experience challenges to accessing DV services. So we've heard many stories of people who were discharged from a psychiatric hospital and brought directly to a domestic violence program and kind of dropped off at the front door without any kind of support, any kind of information, any kind of collaboration that would allow someone to be able to function in that setting and access the services in ways that will benefit them. So there are lots of ways we can partner, and we'll talk about that later, and plus additional custody hurdles. Next slide, please. So now I'm turning it over to you, Gabriella.
Thanks so much. So now some things to keep in mind and some different strategies that can be helpful when offering clinical services. So first, considering multiple domains of safety. So many times we're trained to assess, of course, the potential for harm against self or others. And what we haven't always been trained is to assess the risk of being in danger from others. And so always having that IPV lens and kind of those trauma ears, those IPV ears open, and in that way taking a universal precautions approach to really assessing the multiple domains of potential danger and safety needs. And then looking specifically at psychotropic medication. We know in working with individuals who experience disabling psychiatric conditions that it's really essential that we offer person-centered care and that people are at the center of making decisions around their medications. Now, to go a step further is to also recognize how mental health coercion tactics then end up really sabotaging and endangering somebody's access to their medication and being able to take their medication as prescribed. And so, of course, on top of the things that we would normally do, like discussing benefits and drawbacks and really placing the choice within the person and not trying to kind of pressure people around medication. Also talking with folks around where they keep their medication, who else has access to that, and really listening for whether there are others in their environment, others in their life who are potentially keeping the medication from them, who are potentially forcing them to take too much medication, or abusing them emotionally and in other ways for taking medication. And that, you know, being able to listen for this and talk through this in ways that are destigmatizing and of course non-judgmental can help us then develop plans to take medication safely and maintain control of one's medications. And one thing to keep in mind here is that we do want to be careful around reducing vigilance that may be necessary for the person, that may be part of helping them to survive in that moment.
I already worked in AMD.
So some additional policies and practices that help address IPV-related safety concerns. Of course, establishing whether they are in a confidential and safe place during crisis calls or telehealth encounters. And last time we talked about the telehealth piece, and we'll say a little more later on around the crisis calls. And of course, establishing immediate safety in clinical settings as well as upon discharge. If people are in a residential setting, then what is that home environment like? And as Dr. Warshaw mentioned, you know, while we certainly want to collaborate and connect with anti-violence advocates, we certainly don't want to just be dropping someone off at the front door without any kind of warm handoff and follow-up plan and collaboration. So attention to suicidality and homicidality. And again, we'll say a little more about that further on. Safety planning around mental health and substance use coercion. And then of course, ongoing safety planning, including attention to children. And within all of this, we really need to be taking into account what are somebody's cognitive strengths and how can we adapt all of these services to somebody's cognitive strengths. And then looking at involvement of family members. So we know that involvement of safe social supports, of safe family members is associated with better recovery outcomes overall. That said, we need to really have that lens to have a sense of who is safe to involve in somebody's care, and that we are not going to be assessing that unless they're alone, right? In the last session we talked, and the first session as well, we talked about some different processes to be able to really ask around this. So when it comes to the family support as well as collateral and sources of information, we want to really be sure to include safe family supports. Now, when it comes to getting collateral information from a partner who may be potentially abusive or a family member who may be potentially abusive, we know that for folks living with disabling psychiatric conditions, it's not just intimate partners who may be a source of abuse, but friends, associates, and family members, that there can be a greater kind of complexity of threats when it comes to domestic violence and different sources of abuse. But when we are gathering collateral information, really keeping in mind the potential, right, for abuse to be present, and that this person may be potentially trying to manipulate the assessment process or interfere with their care. And when we're able to recognize abuse tactics, tactics of mental health coercion, then we're also able to help somebody strategize around counteracting them. And we're also able to document them, which can really help folks then later on if there are any kinds of legal kind of proceedings, such as child custody and such as orders of protection. Another piece that becomes really important is to ask about advance directives. That for folks who do have advance directives and power of attorneys, that this may be a way that somebody is really exerting power and control over them. So finding out about guardianship, about power of attorney, about all of these pieces, and assessing for the safety of those individuals, of those relationships, and helping people plan for alternatives if needed. And then, of course, always using professional translators and not using, a significant other or a family member, since we can never be sure then. There's a lot of reasons why, but in this case, that we can't really ensure the safety of that person, and that person may be somebody who is exerting power and control and potentially abusing the person. So addressing safety concerns and suicide risk in the context of IPV. So we want to assess routinely and discuss frankly. And Dr. Warshaw did a really great job of discussing a lot of the risk factors here, especially when people may feel like this is their only option or it's an act of resistance. Some IPV-specific treatment that's found effective for depression and suicidality include these following: the Grady Naya Project, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and that was found particularly effective for Black women, and HOPE. And then, of course, collaboration between our fields. And so in the context of suicide helplines and crisis lines, we have some different resources and kind of decision trees and flow charts to offer. And while this was developed for crisis lines and lifelines, a lot of this is really applicable to when we are also taking those crisis calls and conducting those suicidality assessments in the course of our own clinical work. So when people call in crisis, keeping in mind that part of the crisis they're experiencing may be related to IPV. And so being not only listening for that, but also knowing how to ask, when to ask about it, to get a sense of whether IPV is playing a role. Because left unaddressed, then that danger is going to continue, both the danger from IPV as well as the increased risk for suicidality. So we offer this resource that was done in collaboration with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And I'm going to show a couple of pieces from there that are contained in this resource. So for example, if the person calling is not alone, from a crisis line perspective, discovering that someone is there could come as a relief, could come as great. We have somebody that can help with safety planning, right? But from an IPV perspective, we also need to take into account and consider whether the person may be an abusive partner or family member, or may be contributing to the suicidality or making the caller less safe. That the person may actually be forcing the person to call in order to try to get them admitted to an involuntary hospitalization, or the person may be trying to gather information as to how to get the person involuntarily admitted in order to exert further power, control, and abuse over them. And we've heard so many stories from survivors about how this has really been leveraged as a source of abuse and control. And that we also have some kind of pointers around if suicide is the primary issue versus if danger from an intimate partner is the primary issue. And we have some visuals here. So all this information is also on these visuals that can help kind of think about a decision tree when taking these calls. So if the call comes into if the crisis calls comes in, determining whether they're alone, whether it's safe to talk on the phone right now. If yes, then asking around some IPV red flags. If no, then determining some safety priorities. And you have some different tips here around things that you can ask and things to really be listening for. As well as if suicide is the primary concern versus imminent danger from an abusive partner is the primary concern. And then also we have a resource around a safety planning tip sheet that introduces what is safety planning and then assessing immediate danger and how to assess safety further if there is no immediate danger. And this comes, of course, from the National Domestic Violence Hotline and is included in a resource in our Addressing Suicidality guide. And that also, we don't want to just be addressing this when there's a crisis, of course. That beyond the immediate crisis, we also need to be addressing ongoing safety and just offering information, letting folks know that they're not alone, that, that a lot of people experience intimate partner violence and that we're here to help, that they're not alone in this and that we believe them. Being able to provide information around the dynamics of abuse and what some people have found helpful. And of course, always doing this as guided by the person. That if the person, asking permission before we provide information, if the person, it's not at, the right time, they're not in the right place to be taking in this information, then really finding out what would be helpful right now. And then really following their lead in that, offering choice points whenever possible. As well as offering hope that with the right supports and resources that a lot of people have been able to establish safety and recovery so that they're not alone and that there's hope, right? And that there's a lot of things that can help and that we're not here to judge their relationship. We're not here to judge their choices. It's really up to them what they think would be most helpful. And of course, all along talking about safety strategies to help them really be in control of their mental health care, to be able to access the resources, to be able to be as safe as possible, and to be able to be as safe as possible for themselves and also for their children. And now I will hand it back to Dr. Warshaw.
Dr. Warshaw, I believe you're muted.
Now can you hear me?
Yep, thank you.
Thanks. So again, some of the things that we've already talked about, the intersection of psychiatric disability and mental health coercion, withholding medication, sleep deprivation, custody threats, and we already touched, Gabriella touched base around control of finances and guardianship. Let's see, the only thing that we haven't touched on here is working with people. We touched on this last time, anticipating trauma triggers and being able to distinguish from necessary vigilance, what's keeping you safe and what's getting in the way of your kind of doing the things that are important to you or managing things that you want to be able to manage. And again, adapting to people's cognitive abilities and their ability to process information during a crisis. So just thinking about those together. Next slide, please. Next slide. So these are a couple of things that we thought you could all add into your repertoires in your work with people who are experiencing a psychiatric disability. So one around safety planning, I'll talk a little bit more about psychiatric advanced directives. And the other piece is incorporating DV safety planning into recovery wellness tools that you may be using. RAP is one example. Another thing, if someone is hospitalized or voluntarily or not in a psychiatric hospital, which is less happening now, not happening as much now with during COVID, but having the opportunity to refuse calls or visits from an abusive partner can be very empowering. Helping people maintain phone contact with their children when possible and documenting their care for their children can help when an abusive partner is trying to use their psychiatric condition and hospitalization against them in a custody battle. And again, asking about abuse on admission and doing safety planning or discharge. One of the features of the project, one of the projects that we've worked on, which was a partnership between a DV agency, a state psychiatric hospital, and a large community mental health center, was being able to really work together. People who worked in the hospital were able to spend time at the shelter and know what it's like and help prepare someone who was being discharged from the hospital to be able to go to shelter and maybe keep them a little bit longer so they were ready to handle the shelter conditions. Training people who were recovery support specialists to potentially provide support to women who are in a DV shelter. So there are lots of ways that can happen. Next slide, please. So I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with psychiatric advance directives and the difference between a declaration for mental health treatment and power of attorney for health care, and that the psychiatric advance directives presumes incompetence and requires, it's a legal document that requires witnesses and a physician evaluation to change it. So thinking about safety planning in this context, is the attorney in fact an abusive partner or family member? And is there a way to always think about, talk about psychiatric advance directives as part of DV safety planning? Who's a safe person to have? And what kind of decisions do you want to have made on your behalf? Next slide, please. So again, I think doing this as part of your safety planning helps provide some protection if it keeps an abusive partner from being involved. Next slide, please. So the next couple slides are an adaptation of RAP, which is trademarked, and as I'm assuming many of you are familiar with, is a structured system for wellness self-management developed through planned responses that reduce or modify or eliminate symptoms, and that planned responses from others if you need help to make a decision or to take care of yourself or keep yourself safe. And it involves 6 components plus a wellness toolbox. Next slide, please. And we know that I think it's Advocates for Human Potential now own the trademark to RAP. So this is something that we developed with Mary Ellen Copeland, who was the developer of RAP in 2007. And it was we were trying to think, is there a way to adapt, to incorporate into DV safety planning into wellness recovery tools? And this is just I'm sharing it, it never became an official tool, but it's something that you can think about creatively and with whatever kinds of recovery tools that they're using or the people that you work with are developing for themselves. So for example, as a part of a daily maintenance plan, what I am like when I'm safe and my well-being is attended to, things I can do every day to optimize the safety and well-being of myself and my children. Or the second component around triggers, anticipating things that could be signs of impending violence, or things that when they happen make me feel that I'm not, or that my children aren't safe. Things I can do to optimize my safety, and anticipating my own responses and things I can do to stay calm and think clearly. So it's kind of incorporating the two together. Next slide. Again, early warning signs that danger is escalating or that I'm having trouble managing, and what I can do, or things that indicate the situation's getting worse and I can still take action for myself, and what I can do and who it's safe to involve. Next slide. And then again, crisis plan, what I'm like when I'm safe and my needs are being met, what it looks like when the situation is out of my control, who I want involved, who I don't, what I want done, and again, mobilizing resources. So again, it's just thinking about ways to incorporate things that really are meaningful and familiar to people. Next slide. Again, I started to talk about this, about partnerships with DV programs and the kind of cross-training, cross-referral, and co-location of services that provide supports for survivors in both settings, depending on your community, what resources you have. I mentioned that the partnership with DV programs and peer recovery support organizations and providers in Illinois community support services were supported by Medicaid, and because being in a DV shelter was considered being homeless, there were ways to kind of support those kinds of cross services. Partnerships between domestic violence, traditional housing programs, housing first programs, and mental health supported housing providers to figure out where the best supports and resources are for people so they don't fall through the cracks. And again, people have talked about the need for DV trauma crisis beds and peer respite services. So where could someone go when they're experiencing both a mental health crisis and they need safety from an abusive partner? And again, I think IPV-informed treatment we've talked about, and IPV-specific approaches that address mental health coercion and tailored PTSD treatment. So next slide. We know there are a number of evidence-based treatments for PTSD for people who experience disabling psychiatric conditions. None of them have been tested or evaluated for people experiencing intimate partner violence. And again, when we talked about last time about the evidence base for trauma treatment in the context of intimate partner violence, it's a combination of incorporating IPV-specific dimensions around ongoing risk, cumulative burden, and cultural context, as well as CBT components, psychoeducation. And we know that CBT is effective for PTSD for people who have a disabling psychiatric condition, so incorporating those features might be a way to provide supports and treatment. Trauma Recovery Empowerment Model, TREM, is something that many of you may be familiar with. Maxine Harris developed. It's often used in DV programs as well, that focuses on skill development, intrapersonal, interpersonal, and global skills. So lots of the domains that get disrupted by trauma. And we found that exposure-based therapies, there's some, and EMDR have some promising results, but there's often maybe more disruptive to people who are experiencing both IPV and more disabling psychiatric conditions. Next slide, please. This was a kind of review, a consensus-based review of what expert clinicians found to be helpful for people who were experiencing early psychosis and trauma treatment. And again, individual therapy, some found family or conjoined therapy was helpful, but not potentially in the context of intimate partner violence. Treatments that addressed both trauma symptoms and symptoms of psychosis were helpful. Stress management, psychoeducation, and case management were helpful. Next slide, please. But clearly a lot more research is needed. So in summary, we know that experiences of lifetime trauma and intimate partner violence are very common, particularly among people who are living with disabling psychiatric conditions. They're all associated with increased distress and reduced access to resources. Implementing an accessible, culturally responsive, trauma-informed approach can enhance resilience, safety, and access to mental health services and the effectiveness of mental health services for persons, as well as for staff and for organizations and systems. So this is part of trauma-informed and ACRTI approaches, understanding the impact of trauma and abuse and violence on staff and organizations. We know this can, incorporating all of these dimensions can improve outcomes, and it also means that we need to work together to transform the conditions that produce abuse and violence in our lives and our world. Next slide. Again, in some, making sure that you have strong referral relationships, that everyone's trained, that you incorporate questions about intimate partner violence into your assessment processes, that you incorporate best practices, and that staff really have the kinds of supports they need to be doing this work, both effectively and compassionately. Next slide. So I'm going to end here. I think there's a few seconds for questions. We have lots of resources on our website, and we will respond to questions. This is our webpage for mental health and substance use disorder treatment providers, and we will answer questions that we can't answer in person in the FAQs.
Thank you both very much for a wonderful presentation, a lot of material. I think we are just about at the top of the hour. And so what I'm going to do is hold on taking any questions live. But if you have questions and you want to post them in the chat or in the Q&A, we'll leave it open for just a minute or two here. And then we'll work with the presenters to select a few questions to answer in a Q&A that will be an FAQ rather, that'll be available after the presentation. Also, they have graciously offered their email addresses and for you to reach out directly to them. So please feel free to do that as well. We do ask that you take a minute or two to fill out our assessment. The link is being posted in the chat box, as well as the link to access presentations 1 and 2, and the recording and the slides for this presentation will also be available within the next several days. So thank you both, Dr. Warshaw and Gabriella. We appreciate your presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended. We hope you have a good rest of the week and that everyone stays safe and well. Thank you so much.